why did economists not see the crisis coming?
Well, people think economists are experts on the economy. And they're not experts on the economy, they're experts on a model of the economy. That applies to me just as much as to any other economist. Neoclassical economists are the dominant school of thought in economics in general. And they're the ones who overwhelmingly staff treasuries, the OECD, the IMF and so on. They run all the models that politicians take seriously. And they, well, of course, as a result, the minority that I come from are ignored. So that majority model is what people are looking at. And the majority model of the economy has no banks in it, has no money, and has no debt. So there's absolutely no possibility somebody looking at that model would see that there's about to be a crisis caused by the banks lending too much money and creating too much debt. If you look back in the 19th century, it makes plenty of sense to do what the conventional neoclassical economists, the founding fathers of neoclassical economics did back then, Marshall, Jevons and co. And they pretty much said that it's just too difficult to model a dynamic process, even though we know the economy is dynamic. So let's make a little simplifying assumption, given the technology we have in the 19th century, of assuming everything happens in equilibrium. And therefore we've got to set up the conditions that mean that equilibrium is guaranteed to occur, and then see how that might move to the next period, also be in equilibrium and so on. And that's what Vollrahr attempted. And that made sense in its own way in the 19th century because we didn't have computers, and even though mathematicians knew about differential equations and dynamic modelling back then, it all had to be stuff you could solve symbolically. You couldn't do a numerical estimation of it. Well, that was then. Fast forward to now, we have incredible advances in computing, so we can simulate dynamic systems. We don't have to assume anything's in equilibrium and force a false assumption on a system which we know is not in equilibrium. And we know far more about chaos theory, and we know that systems, dynamic systems like the weather, for example, are never in equilibrium. And one of the major advances in weather technology, for example, was by Lorenz back in the 1960s, because he was dissatisfied with the techniques that meteorologists used back then to try to predict the weather, where they made the assumption that it was all linear and equilibrium. He said that just isn't true. Most of the effects in the weather system are out of equilibrium effects. So he built his own first dynamic model, and that's where these incredible weather reports we look at now actually began, right back with that step from equilibrium modelling of a weather system which we know is not in equilibrium, across to disequilibrium modelling, which they call dynamic modelling in proper sciences. And out of that we have a very, very rich picture now of the weather's behaviour, with all the other fantastic graphics we watch on the daily news. Minsky was a very unusual economist in the mid-50s. He did his PhD in the 50s in America. Unusual because most economists work inside the neoclassical school of thought and try to build more elaborate models that express their vision of an economy where everything is in equilibrium and everything is properly balanced and in harmony, and all the problems come from what they call frictions, which involve prices adjusting too slowly, or unions putting wages too high, or government intervening and causing bubbles and so on. That's the neoclassical view. Minsky said, look, capitalism had a huge crisis in the 1930s, and if you have a model of the economy that can't generate that crisis, then you haven't got a model of the economy. So what we have to have is a model of the economy that explains both the good times, which obviously the 1950s were the good times, and also explains the bad times. So he tried to build a model that explained both the prosperity of the 1950s and 60s and the incredible crisis of the 1930s. And he did that by adding to the work of his PhD supervisor, who was Joseph Schumpeter, who was the greatest evolutionary economist ever. And he took Schumpeter's vision of an evolutionary capitalist economy with cycles where finance plays an essential role in providing entrepreneurs with investment funds. He added to that the fact that, well, as well as funding entrepreneurs, they also fund Ponzi schemes. They fund people who speculate on rising asset prices rather than producing new commodities with that borrowed money, and rather than getting the cyclical behaviour that you get out of Schumpeter, you get a cycle with a tendency for the level of debt to rise over time. And then you get to a point like the 1930s, or obviously again 2007, 2008, where so much debt's been taken on by this Ponzi behaviour that the debt acceleration stops, goes into reverse, and the economy goes down with it.
What is the Minsky project?
Minsky project is a construction of a software program that will make it possible to do macroeconomic modelling where money plays an essential role and where banks are a fundamental part of the system. That's, in a nutshell, that's what it is. And that is easy with modern computer technology. So we've got a computer programmer who is currently on his own writing the software right now in a whole range of base computer programming language, C++ and so on. And he's writing a system which gives you a canvas on which you can place objects which are variables like output, GDP, labour, etc., and simulate them dynamically. Now there's plenty of software packages that already do that with, of course, far more sophistication than we can currently do, but they've got years and years and years of development behind them. But what we're adding is the capacity to model money, and that's done very simply by putting an accounting table into the system, many accounting tables that you need to represent government money creation, private bank creation of money, etc., And with that tabular layout that accountants perfected 500 years ago, 600 years ago, that's a very simple framework for building a dynamic model of financial transactions. Whereas if you try to use the flowchart model that systems like Simulink and VISSIM, Stellar, I think VENSIM all use right now, because the financial process involves at least 2 entries for every transaction. Using the flowchart analogy that these software packages get, you get an unholy mess of cables going all over the place. And it's simply, A, it's impossible to interpret, and B, it's really, really difficult to extend the design. But with what Minsky adds, with a simple table up there, if you want to add another social class in there, you whack in another column. If you want to add another transaction, you whack in another row, and bang, the system expands very, very simply, and it's very, very easy to understand. So I believe with Minsky we'll be able to teach students a completely monetary approach to economics right from the first lecture in first year. And at the extreme end, this scales right up from the stage of modelling the abstraction of a single banking sector with a single commodity economy, right through to multiple commodities, multiple banks, and international trade and finance flows. So ultimately, I think it will do for economics what Lorenz's models have done for meteorology.